die. But he was the very reason that they couldn't let it die, because he got away with murder. When there's an injustice like that, people don't forget. There's no closure, and there's nothing like that. And so that's what people, that's what we talk about the past, to try to understand it, to not let a tragedy like this go away and just be swept under the rug. But he would have been happy with that. And so to his dying day, he had that bitterness about what the trial did to him. He had bitterness, but no remorse. He had regret, but no remorse. And that's something I learned. So the good people in the story prospered, did well. The bad people, not so much. So that there was never a conviction. We can learn that maybe in the long run that didn't matter. Also, with the course of the investigation, the FBI investigation, they found the trial transcript, which had been missing for decades. Turns out a man who was a son of one of the defense witnesses for Milam and Bryant somehow obtained this copy, and when he learned that the FBI was wanting it, somehow the communication between the FBI and him, they were able to get the trial transcript from him. And that was, to me, like, when I read that for the first time, and after the case ended and was closed, the FBI released this online. And I read it, and for the first time in 50 years, I'm seeing these voices from the dust, so to speak, suddenly talking. No one had read this in decades, and suddenly there's Moses Wright in court. There's all these people in court, people that, even witnesses I didn't know about, because they were minor witnesses and didn't make the paper, and suddenly there they are speaking. This whole thing suddenly came alive. And so I was so excited when that came out that I couldn't stop reading. I read the whole thing in just one sitting, and then I started examining it and incorporating this into my book. That's just one of the things the FBI discovered. Another thing the FBI discovered was, there were more people involved in the case, that we knew. But one of them was a brother of J.W. Milam, who basically confessed to this on his deathbed. Leslie Milam, in 1974, he was the manager of the farm where Emmett Till was killed. And the witnesses saw and heard Emmett Till being beaten to death inside of a shed in Drew, Mississippi. J.W. Milam and Roy were there, but there were two other men too. Probably, well, one of them was for sure Leslie Milam. The other one was probably a brother-in-law named Melvin Campbell. But Leslie Milam, for 19 years after the murder of Emmett Till, started feeling some guilt. As he was on his deathbed dying from cancer, his wife called a local minister, Macklin Hubble, to come over and talk to him. She told him, Leslie is dying, he wants to talk to you. So Macklin Hubble went over to the Milam home. Leslie Milam was, and I talked to this minister a couple of years ago. In the FBI report, he talks about this story, but his name is redacted from the account because he was still alive. And anybody who was alive at the time the FBI issued its report, their names aren't mentioned. So I had to go do some digging on my own to find out who these people were. Macklin Hubble's son called me and said, my dad was that minister. And I said, would he mind talking to me, and would he mind his name being in the book? And he said, I'm sure he wouldn't. So that's exactly what happened. I talked to him, and he said Leslie Milam could barely, he was on the couch, he couldn't even raise his head. But and he had to speak in a whisper that was so low you could barely hear him. But he told this minister that he was involved in the murder of Emmett Till and wanted to get this off his chest. And he died the next morning. And Macklin Hubble spoke at his funeral a few days later. Again, this is in the FBI report, but I talked to this minister and got a little more of the story that he was willing to go on the record for my book. And so the investigation did show that. Now it's interesting, we wouldn't have really known that detail if the FBI hadn't investigated the case, but Macklin Hubble was alive and living in, I think, Cleveland, Mississippi, and knew this story, just didn't really tell it to anybody all these years. And there were stories like that out there that just never got told because nobody ever asked. Early on, it was because they were afraid to tell, probably. Some of the people that saw these, heard the murder, heard it happening and all of that. And in time, when they didn't fear anymore, because the FBI was investigating, they were able to find out and talk to these people. And I was doing my research at the same time, and so I was able to talk to the FBI agent who investigated the case, but he had to talk to me with another FBI agent on the phone because these people were still alive, a lot of them, and so he couldn't tell me. If I asked him, did you interview Carolyn Bryant? All he could say was no comment. But you see that the report with his investigation, his investigative report, you know he talked to Carolyn Bryant. That's the only person that could be, except her name is crossed out. And so the FBI still had to keep quiet about things, so I had to go talk to other people. One of the people I talked to was someone, I can't reveal the name because this is someone very close to Carolyn. She told me that when the FBI, did I say she? This person told me that when the FBI opened the case, this person called Carolyn and said, you know, they're going to want to talk to you, and you might as well get it out of the way. Carolyn didn't ever want to talk about this case, but this person talked her into it. So this person drove Carolyn to a federal building, I think it was in Greenville, where the FBI agent was there, and he interviewed her for a long time, and this other person waited out in the lobby while Carolyn was in there. When Carolyn came out of the interview, this person that was with her said it was very clear that Carolyn had been crying. And this person asked Carolyn how it went, and Carolyn said one of the things they asked her is that over the years, have you thought about Emitt's mother? And she said, well, I'm a mother, of course I have. And then she burst out sobbing. She talked to the FBI, kind of kept her original story from 1955. When she talked to another historian a few years ago, she told a little more. In her trial testimony, she said that Emitt had groped her and propositioned her and grabbed her by the waist and jumped behind the candy counter and wouldn't let her go. She didn't really, I don't know what she said, she didn't really address that in those specifics into the FBI, but she told Tim Tyson that part of the story was not true. She admitted all these years later making that up. Well, I learned during the course of my research that she definitely made that up because I found a deposition she gave to the attorneys just a couple days after Emitt's murder, where she says in the interview that all he did was whistle at her. He came in the store, bought bubble gum, whistled at her. Another boy came in and said, let's go, and they went out peacefully together. The story she gave in court was all a pack of lies about Emitt groping her and doing all this. Well, during my research, I learned that was already, I didn't need her confession 50 years later to tell me that she was lying, because she admitted to lying when I found this deposition. Another thing I found was when Moses Wright when Bryant Milam came into the house and kidnapped Emmett Till, Roy Bryant basically said, this is Mr. Bryant, I want to talk to you and the boy from Chicago. And Moses Wright said in court that I knew that was Roy Bryant because he identified himself as such. One of the defense attorneys in court said, who, if they're gonna commit murder, would ever identify themselves? There must be a million Mr. Bryants out there. Do you think if he was gonna commit murder, he'd really come into someone's home and say, this is Mr. Bryant? Well, the defense attorney said that in court, but I found something in his own handwriting, this defense attorney, after an interview with Roy Bryant, where he said Roy Bryant did identify himself. This was said a couple of weeks before the trial. So this defense attorney knew, he got that confession from Roy Bryant saying, yes, when I went over there to kidnap him, I identified who I was. But that same attorney gets up in court and says, who would ever do that? So that attorney knew it and basically was lying. I found those types of things, and the end result of all of this, and I guess we're about out of time. Oh, it's 8. My gosh, I went over. Sorry about that. Was that this story unfolded in a certain way that allowed me, decades later, to help piece it, to find out what really happened, who said what, who lived what kind of life, who was lying at the time, finding documents that weren't around for earlier historians, like these depositions, they were something that just kind of came along from the attorney's offices that were donated to another file that made their way to me. I kept thinking, I wish I could have finished this book years earlier, but had I have done so, it would have been so incomplete that it wouldn't have been worth the read that it is now. And I feel like I was almost meant to be, to do certain things, to wait in a certain way, and to write certain things, and to wait for certain things to become available. And as a result, I feel like I really have written a comprehensive book. It's not a perfect book. Someone will come along maybe decades from now, build upon it in some way, but I feel like right now that the comprehensive book on Emmett Till that historians have been waiting for is here. And those of you who have it, hope you read it. If you do, let me know what you think. Review it on Amazon.com, because I need the reviews to pile up. But I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you see and can appreciate the time and effort that went into it. Thank you.